So let's talk about Christianity. It can be a pretty divisive topic. Like, really divisive. Go look up on how many sects there are in the US alone, and you'll see what I mean. But we're not really here today to talk about the US. No, today we're going to talk about one of the strangest events in the splitting of the Eastern and Western churches, or what some people call the Great Schism. Try to remember for a moment that before this, Christianity was unified. Yeah, there were heresies, but on the whole, there was unity. Most of that was because of something called the Roman Empire. You know, that big sprawling unsustainable blob of the latter classical period. Of course, eventually, that empire was split in two, between East and West. That defined religion too. In the East, there were lots of different patriarchs, one for every major city. Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and of course Constantinople all had one, with Constantinople being the most important one because it was also the seat of the emperor. In the West, though, there's only one, Rome. And the fact that there was only one in the West didn't escape the patriarch of Rome either. You might recall that later they became the popes. That should tell you something about how important they thought of themselves as, and how they came to be. So alright, you got two capitals of two empires who both act like they're the head of their respective regions' religions. What could go wrong? Well, the Western Empire could fall. That could be a problem. The Patriarch of Rome could also start being a political figure. That could be a problem. The traditions of the two regions could change. That could be a problem. Actually, just about everything went wrong that could go wrong between these two groups, and it was just going to get worse. See, the two groups argued over things like using leavened or unleavened bread. See, in Rome, they used unleavened bread, because they argued it's what Jesus had, so that's what they should use. In the East, they used leavened bread, because they argued that if Jesus had it available, that's what he would have used. That's a pretty small thing, though, right? I mean, no one would ever split a religion over something like that. Well, what if the Patriarch of Rome started saying that he had dominion over the entirety of Christianity? Remember, there's no such thing as denominations at this point. It's all one faith. As you can imagine, the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call the Byzantine Empire, wasn't too happy about that, given that he was head of the church. Much like the Queen of England today is head of their church. Well, then you also had Western monks changing the Nicene Creed. What's the creed? Well, it goes something like this. And in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father, who with the Father and the Son is adored and glorified. Pretty simple, right? Well, it was, until the monks and bishops in the West started changing it by adding something, specifically the line, and the Son. So now it read, and in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son, who with the Father and the Son is adored and glorified. See, the word filioque is Latin for and the Son, and despite it being one word, it pissed a whole lot of people off. Why? Well, in the West, they said it was to clarify the Son's role. In the East, they said it turned the Trinity into a hierarchy. It's a lot more complicated than that, but we're not here to discuss theology, so suffice it to say, there was a big problem. You could also point out things like Western priests were celibate and Eastern priests were allowed to marry. The main thing to take away from this is that there were a lot of issues going on between the two sides, and we really don't want to be here forever. But by now you're probably wondering, gee, didn't they try to, solve these issues? As it turns out, yeah, they did. How? By holding councils. Think of them like congressional committees today. Everyone shows up, talks about stuff, files a bunch of motions, and then they all leave, agreeing to set up another committee to reflect upon what this one did. And like congressional committees, they didn't resolve the issues. All of this came to a head in 1054, when external issues created a situation that forced the two sides to talk. And what was that catalyst? Why, the Normans, of course. Now you may remember that some guy named William the Bastard would conquer England in about 12 years, and that should tell you something about the kind of guys the Normans were. But why were they a threat to both sides? Well, the Normans were, at the time, trying to conquer southern Italy, of all places. This, of course, threatened both the Roman Church and the possessions of the Byzantine Emperor. Clearly, an agreement needed to be reached. Both sides wanted mostly similar things. Rome needed Byzantine military might, and the Byzantine Emperor was happy to give it, provided the Roman Patriarch stopped causing so many issues and fell in line with the head of the church, namely the Emperor. Now remember, they didn't have email or phones at that time, so the Pope, Leo IX, dispatched a delegate to Constantinople to negotiate the treaty for him. Of course, a papal delegation has all the same powers and authority as the Pope. Remember that, it'll be important later. Now the delegate that Leo IX sent was a man named Humbert of Silva Candida. He was a Benedictine monk and was meant to be the Archbishop of Sicily. But then, Normans. Now for those of you that don't know, Benedictine monks follow the rule of St. Benedict, which is insanely strict, and as such, Humbert was not exactly an accommodating man. Humbert was, however, a very learned man, and was the papal secretary. You know, that guy who translates letters and composes them. So as someone so smart, logically you'd think he'd be a good choice to send to negotiate. I mean, come on, he's smart, he's religious, and he's only got one job to do. That job? Convince the Byzantine Emperor to send his military to protect Rome from the Normans. That's it. Nothing more. Remember this, it's important. Now, Roman emperors don't negotiate themselves. That's why they have people who work for them. And the emperor at the time, Emperor Constantine IX, wasn't exactly the best ruler. He was very much a pleasure-seeking emperor, and under his watch the empire was invaded countless times by plenty of groups, not to mention that there were plenty of revolts too. In fact, he would be deposed a year after this meeting between East and West took place, which should tell you just about how capable a ruler he was. Anyway, Emperor Constantine IX put a guy named Michael Carolarius in charge of negotiating. Why? Well, he was the Patriarch of Constantinople. Of course, there was the problem that Michael Carolarius spent much of his time fighting with Pope Leo IX, mostly over all the things that I mentioned before. But perhaps the bigger problem, and the more telling one, is that Carolarius addressed himself as the ecumenical patriarch. Why is that important? Because traditionally, all the patriarchs are equal, meaning the Pope is equal to the Patriarch of Antioch, and he's equal to the Patriarch of Constantinople. But by calling himself the ecumenical patriarch, he's saying that he's more important and has more authority than any of the other patriarchs. This, of course, wasn't really a problem in the East, given the fact that places like Antioch and Alexandria were being taken over by the Arab invasions at the time. But the Pope wasn't too happy about the fact that he was being told he was second fiddle to Constantinople. As you might imagine, good old Carolarius was completely behind the idea that he was above some backwater patriarch in Rome. And remember, Rome in 1054 wasn't exactly the giant metropolis of the early classical period. Regardless, Carolarius had the rather moderate opinion that the Western Christians were all heretics and should be forcibly made to reconvert to proper Eastern methods. So to sum it all up, you have a bad military situation with some Normans going on, and the solution was to have two extremely conservative and headstrong individuals try to work it out for both sides. I mean, really, what could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, neither man was particularly willing to work with the other, despite it being, their job to work together, as given to them by the heads of their respective churches. First, Carolarius refused to meet with Humbert for months, meaning Humbert was sitting around doing nothing in Constantinople while Carolarius kept him waiting. As you might recall, though, marauding Norman armies don't exactly wait around for other people to make deals against them, and waiting around for months didn't do either side any favors in trying to resist them. Then, finally, after months of waiting, Carolarius let Humbert meet with him. The result? 3 days of constant arguing and threats from both sides, each declaring that the other submit to their demands. It seemed as though neither side was going to reach any sort of agreement quickly, but no one expected what came next. Humbert, you might recall, as a papal legate, had all the authority of the Pope, and with that authority, he decided the best course of action was to excommunicate Carolarius and the Emperor. Wait, what? Carolarius, in response, excommunicated Humbert and Pope Leo IX. Wait, what? How exactly on earth did you go from trying to agree to fight the Normans to damning each other to hell for all eternity? Well, as it turned out, at least a few of those excommunications weren't exactly valid. See, during those months that Humbert was waiting, Pope Leo IX died, meaning Humbert had no papal authority until a new pope gave it to him. Also, being dead meant the excommunication by Carolarius wasn't valid either. Of course, because these are churches we're talking about, these excommunications weren't lifted until 1965. Damn, that's a long time. So yeah, what was meant to be a simple and routine treaty for troops turned into a debacle. As you can imagine, it didn't really help Christianity as a whole, even if at the time people really didn't think it was that important that two major religious leaders had just damned two major political figures to hell forever. As for everyone involved, well, Carolarius convinced his emperor to abdicate a year later, and then he decided to try and fight with the guy who he put on the throne in the first place, Emperor Isaac Komnenos, over Emperor Isaac's decision to confiscate church property. Carolarius, annoyed by this, decided to do something about it and decided to wear purple shoes. Yes, purple shoes. As it turns out, only the emperor can wear purple shoes in the Byzantine Empire, and by doing so, Carolarius was essentially sending the message that he was basically the emperor. He also apparently decided to plan a rebellion, but failed. He was then told to abdicate his position and go into exile, but refused, and so Emperor Isaac charged him with heresy and treason. Perhaps luckily he died before that trial actually happened. As for Humbert, well, he went back and helped his friend and fellow legate, Pope Stephen IX, get made pope, and then he became the papal librarian. Then he accused Henry I of France of tyranny and simony, also known as selling positions in the church to people for money. Not exactly the best idea, given that Pope Stephen IX decided to side with the French to protect the papal lands, given that Humbert sort of botched getting help from the Byzantines to protect against the French. Oh, and a year later, Humbert came up with the idea of getting the popes elected by the cardinals. This worked so well that within the next 10 years there were no less than 3 schisms, as all the cardinals vied for power, and their various backers made the candidates' claims back to the military force. Basically, anti-popes started popping up as cardinals refused to agree, and forced politics to become decidedly more cutthroat. Humbert then died in 1061, after causing uncountable amounts of chaos in the church. So in short, 2 guys who couldn't compromise on anything were put in charge of working things out, and instead, the 2 of them ended up causing their respective societies to spiral out of control. So remember, no matter how bad you feel, no matter how bad you think you're doing, you'll probably never screw up as bad as these 2 guys.